are going to hear Professor Miriam Bodian of the University of Texas at Austin, whose studies on early modern history and Spanish history are well known. Professor Bodian is going to talk about Portuguese ex-Converso Jews and the language of freedom.
Okay, I don't need it at the moment. I want to just start. First of all, I was going to thank, as we all have, Dove, and I do thank him for organizing this wonderful conference. And I want to start by saying that putting my talk in the framework of, Dove, you just missed my expression of gratitude for organizing the conference.
In absentia.
I want to actually start by framing what I have to say within my thoughts about what has been said about the title of this conference until this point. And I have to say that there's a special talent for giving titles to conferences, and I really want to express my thanks again to Dove for giving it a title that's so rich in possibilities, and the political dimensions of the Converso phenomenon in Portugal and beyond. And by the way, I belong beyond with Nadia. The political dimensions of the Converso phenomenon in Portugal and beyond. And I would just start with the term politics. And I was thinking about this at lunch, and I went online to see, I hadn't bothered, but what does Merriam-Webster, the famous dictionary, say about politics? 1, activities that relate to influencing the actions and policies of a government or getting and keeping power in a government. 2, the work or job of people who are part of government. And 3, the opinions that someone has about what should be done by governments, a person's political thoughts and opinions. And I think we've heard several, not corresponding to that, but 3 ideas about conversos and politics, 3 different ideas. And I'm going to be working on one of them, so I just want to sort of block out the way I see them. The first, yes, political action, and whether it's a continuation of what's known as Jewish Stadtlandnut, which is representing Jews before the authorities, or we heard the term court conversos, Hof conversos, who are able to lobby either for themselves or on behalf of other new Christians. This is in the way of political action insofar as a people who don't really have political power can be engaged in political action, and we see that in all periods of Jewish history. The other, I would say, is something like religio-political policies concerning conversos, which is really quite different. But what I would like to talk about has to do with another topic that has also been raised here, and that is the political consciousness of Jews. So partly because my period comes after the period that's been discussed here, I'm going to take a somewhat different look at conversos who are now Jews in Amsterdam, and the creation, or let's say the development of a kind of political consciousness that I would say is certainly much more modern than anything we've seen thus far today. I just want to remind us that the term politics itself has no Hebrew equivalent, pre-modern equivalent. We're being taken back to a Greco-Roman reality, and that's certainly part of the story. So what I would like to say first, before we begin another introduction, is that in the 1980s, but especially now in the wake of 9/11 and the rise of Islamic radicalism, there's been a revived interest and recognition in something that is known as civil religion. This concept refers to the mobilization of religion for the purpose of enhancing allegiance to the secular values of the state and entails the sacralization of those values. This serves an important role in many modern states, the United States and Israel, in fact. And I want to take a look at how it was at the very moment when the discussion of religion as a tool of state became active among European thinkers, Hobbes, Spinoza, go back to Machiavelli, that the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam found themselves induced to participate for the first time in a Gentile civil religion discourse. The situation in which the Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam found themselves anticipates, I think, the more psychologically fraught situation of the Jews of modern Western and Central Europe, who were drawn to incorporate into their Jewish practice, with different degrees of pressure, expressions of identification with national values. It raises the important question of the extent to which, on the one hand, such participation has served to reinforce a distinctive Jewish identity by giving it acceptance on a national stage, even though in a selective, stripped-down form, and on the other hand, the extent to which it has a corrosive impact on internal religious discourse among Jews, domesticating it and minimizing its dissonant features. As such, the Dutch-Portuguese Jewish case reflects a broader ongoing conversation about how a minority religion can participate over time in the anodyne rituals of civil religion without compromising the sources of its vitality. So I want to turn to the Portuguese Jews who began trickling into the Dutch Republic in the 1590s and to a much greater extent after 1609. It was certainly not obvious from the start that these Jews would feel comfortable participating in any kind of Dutch civil religion. Despite the favorable conditions they were offered in the Netherlands, there was a strong psychological obstacle to such participation, namely an instinctive defensive posture towards all things Christian that had developed over many generations in Spain and Portugal. And obviously I'm talking here about those Jews who came to Amsterdam with Jewish loyalties, and I believe that constitutes the majority of them. Indeed, it was precisely the uncompromising refusal of Jews in Christian lands to participate in Gentile religion that had typically been honored in Jewish tradition and lore. Such a refusal lies at the heart of the story of Esther in the Persian Empire, so popular among crypto-Jews. It also informs the traditional Jewish understanding of the Jewish revolt against the Hellenists and later against Rome. In early modern Spain and Portugal, there was of course no place at all for Jewish life, whether public or private, and crypto-Jews upheld Jewish honor through the risky, secret rejection of all things Christian. In short, a tradition of refusal and martyrdom going back to antiquity, a tradition that was perpetuated in the sermons and polemical writings of Portuguese Jewish rabbinic scholars, served to cement the psychological barrier that separated Gentile impurity and Jewish holiness. But if there were strong psychological and theological obstacles to the participation of Portuguese Jews in a publicly shared civil religion in Amsterdam, there were also strong and novel incentives to do so. And I like to illustrate within the limits of this paper by examining one concept, showing how a conceptual shift took place in the way Portuguese Jews grasped the idea of liberty or freedom in a way that allowed them to share this religio-political concept with the Dutch. To be more specific, I'd like to show how a primarily ethnocentric and sacralized rabbinic conception of liberty, expressed in Hebrew by the term geut, underwent change among Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam as a result of their encounter with the Dutch, so that it came to refer, or to refer also, to a universal political value endorsed by Scripture and shared with other peoples. You can see it at play here. A process that facilitated the internalization among Jews of a secular political principle, at least partly by means of its association with Jewish sacred themes. Let me go back to the concept of freedom among Jews in antiquity briefly, with the help of a study by Shlomo Pinus. In the Hebrew Bible, Pinas pointed out, there's no equivalent of the Latin term libertas or its Greek equivalent. The terms chofshi and chufsha appear there, but they're not used in their modern sense. They refer exclusively to the liberation of an individual slave and have a juridical, not a political meaning. The terms ga'al and geula appear also, but they too are not political. They refer to actions taken by God to redeem Israel. A term that more closely approximates the Greco-Roman concept, cherut, appears only in the 1st century and was probably transferred from the Greco-Roman environment. Its early use is well known from the Haggadah passage, mi'avdut lecherut, from slavery to cherut. This term was a political one, closely associated with the 1st and 2nd century Jewish efforts to achieve freedom from Roman rule. It appears in that sense on coins of the period and in passages from Josephus. But Shlomo Pinas has argued that the concept of cherut nevertheless differed from Greco-Roman concepts from which it was derived. Jews did not traditionally view freedom as a value in itself and as a source of national pride, as the Greeks did at the time the concept emerged. The underlying theological political aim of the Jewish rebels was to be free of Roman rule in order to serve God as their only overlord. And this topic of the Jewish idea of being a people ruled by God, of course, has come up before, and that's central to the concept that the Portuguese Jews brought with them. This idea of freedom from impediments to serving God as part of a Jewishly providentialist, biblically inspired collective narrative was very much part of the vision of crypto-Jews and Portuguese Jewish emigres in Northern Europe, and this is very well documented. At the very heart of the Portuguese Jewish founding myth was the theme of the kingship of God and God's redemption of the Jews from bondage. This biblically inflected discourse was usually anti-Gentile in that it emphasized the tyranny of a Gentile regime, which was often identified with Egypt, Babylonia, or Edom, that is, Rome, or more directly with Spain and Portugal. It's reflected in the terms used by communal leaders to make geographical distinctions: terras de idolatria for Spain and Portugal on the one hand, and terras libres for Italy and the Netherlands on the other. It's most significant that the term terras libres, lands of freedom, was synonymous with the terras de judaismo. These were lands where one was free to practice Judaism. This traditional idea of freedom had meaning only in the context of the Jewish historical scenario. As such, it reflected an exclusive and ethnocentric worldview. Yet, although this narrative continued to thrive in the Portuguese Jewish literature of the 17th century, there were signs alongside it of an effort to harmonize the exclusively Jewish story with a new providentialist narrative of shared liberation based on a universal principle of political freedom, one that was essentially alien to rabbinic tradition. And I'm not going to get into the messianic millenarian politics here. That's really a separate subject, which I don't have time for, but it's certainly an interesting one that we see it's blossoming at this point. The emigres who settled in Amsterdam found themselves among Christians who, like Christians everywhere, saw themselves as the new Israel, but who in a quite new way identified positively with the biblical Old Israel. The Exodus story was also their story, a template for their own national history of repression and liberation. In this narrative, the Dutch were represented as Nederlands Israël, Netherlands Israel, the spiritual successors to the Israelites. But there were two competing ideas of Nederlands Israël. These ideas emerged as part of a fundamental debate about church-state relations in the Dutch Republic, one that the Portuguese Jews observed with keen interest from the sidelines. For those in the rigorous camp of Calvinists, the counter-remonstrants, victory over the Spanish had been essentially a victory for the true faith, the Calvinist faith. In the confessionalizing spirit of the post-Reformation period, These Calvinists saw it as their duty to make Dutch society essentially a Calvinist theocracy, with the church supervising religious life and ensuring that Dutch national life reflected the true faith. This exclusivist idea of Nederlands Israël, one of the true faith being coextensive with the people, along with the kingship of God, was in structure analogous to the traditional Jewish perspective. But the Dutch Republic had been a multi-religious state from the start. Catholic Netherlanders had fought the Spanish foe side by side with Calvinists and remained a very large sector of the population, some say the majority. Many Netherlanders, even if they sympathized with the Calvinist church, were not formal members of that church. Moreover, Dutch society included, of course, Anabaptists, Lutherans, and other Protestant dissenters. Given the provincial and religious fragmentation of the new republic, what was needed was a compelling and inclusive foundational narrative. In the course of the revolt against Spain, a principle of liberty of conscience gained wide acceptance. Indeed, the foundational document for the new republic, the Union of Utrecht, stipulated in 1579 that the various regulations to be drawn up by the provinces should guarantee that, quote, each individual enjoys freedom of religion and no one is persecuted or questioned about his religion. Dutch patriotism thus became linked at a very early point to religious freedom. A religio-political vision of Nederlands Israël, one that drew from humanist roots shared by Calvinists and Catholics alike, allowed Netherlanders of all creeds to understand the revolt as a revolt against tyranny over conscience. This was the conception of Nederlands Israël that became, with the support of the Remonstrants, a crucial element in the formation of Dutch society. The inclusivist narrative of Nederlands Israël that emerged then was one that could make bold religious claims but avoid confessional, that is, denominational claims. Defining the national project as it did as a religious project in no way reflected what we would call a modern conception of the state, but it provided a kind of bridge because it supported a republican idea of government, not the Orangist monarchy favored by the rigorists, and infused that form of government with religious meaning. The founding figure of Moses was represented in this narrative not as a king, which only God could be, but as the archetypal legislator, a theme that became quite prominent also among English Protestant Puritans. As the popular Dutch Catholic poet Joost van Vondel wrote in 1659 in a poem which he titled On Moses Receiving the Law, he wrote, "The Hebrew Moses has received the law from God with which he returns from above to the people who greet him with respect and welcome him with longing. As the people honor the laws, so shall a free state stand." I promise you it sounds better in the rhyme Dutch original, but it's the idea that I wanted to get by you here of Moses, the legislator, ensuring freedom. There was nothing new about representing the state in religious terms. That was the norm in early modern Europe. What was novel was a cross-confessional religious rhetoric that supported a free state where citizens could worship as they chose. Although Vondel's poem associated freedom of religion with a biblical text that from a Jewish point of view concerned only the religio-national fate of Israelites, the poem universalized that principle by making it foundational for a multi-religious nation, a kind of polity that was unimaginable in the traditional Jewish national narrative. While an easy conflation of meanings may have hidden the difference, and this is something that is very important to understand in this period, just how much of that kind of conflation there is, this concept of freedom diverged significantly from the strongly ethnocentric concept of cherut in Jewish lore. The identification of modern political principles of freedom, justice, and equality with principles in Jewish tradition became an important component of Jewish self-image in modern Western societies. What is striking is that a similar dynamic among the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam can be seen much earlier and with much less overt pressure. It would seem that an awareness and appreciation of a more universal political principle of religious freedom developed quite early on. This can be seen in a rabbinic query, it's well known, She'elah, sent from Amsterdam to Salonika in 1616, most likely by Rabbi Joseph Pardo. The author writes about the city of Amsterdam as background to the conditions Jews enjoyed there, and while this paragraph is familiar, not everybody here knows the history of the Jews in Amsterdam, and in any case, I want to parse it carefully. Today, a tranquil and secure people dwells in Amsterdam, and the officials of the city have sought to expand the settlement, that is, the city, and to establish laws concerning it. Among these laws, they have allowed every man to believe in divine matters as he chooses, and each lives according to his faith, as long as he does not go about the markets and streets displaying his opposition to the faith of the residents of the city, meaning Calvinism. This passage, on the face of it, seems surprising. Jewish worship in Amsterdam, at least until 1639, or perhaps a little before that, was technically in one respect more restricted than it had typically been in medieval Europe. While the Jews were granted freedom of conscience, as it was generally understood by contemporaries, they were not granted freedom of public worship, which was a quite distinct concept. That is, they were required to hold services in private homes rather than in synagogue structures, or synagogue structures disguised as homes. Of course, no one prevented the Jews of Amsterdam from practicing Judaism, but then neither did anyone in Prague, Livorno, Constantinople, or any other place where Jews were allowed to reside. The author of the passage was, as I said, most likely Joseph Pardo, who grew up in Salonika and lived for a time in the Venetian ghetto, both places where Jews lived in autonomous communities and freely practiced Judaism. So what was so novel to the author of this passage about the status of Jews in the Netherlands? The difference, it seems to me, had to do with a departure from the classic mechanism for permitting Jews to settle among non-Jews in medieval and early modern times. This mechanism had been the granting of a privilege, which literally is a private law, which invariably included special restrictions as well as special taxes. It was granted for pragmatic reasons and could be, and often was, revoked or not renewed. It offered limited legal protection based on time-honored custom, but did not inhibit Christian governments from using coercion to convert, harass, or expel Jews. There's an emotional excitement about the above passage that seems related to the sense of normality a Jew could feel walking the canals of Amsterdam. There's no easy way to document the atmosphere of casual acceptance of religious difference that observers of 17th century Dutch society noted. Willem Freyhoff has described it with the phrase, quote, the ecumenacy of everyday life. For whatever reasons, this ecumenacy, this neighborliness among Calvinists, Catholics, Collegians, Mennonites, Anabaptists, and so on, expanded to include, in a significant way, the classic outsiders in European life. Despite the occasional inflammatory rhetoric of angry Reformed clergy, the Dutch, unlike other Europeans, did not regard the Jews as a dangerous polluting presence. The absence of physical danger, of insults, and of visual assaults on their dignity meant that Portuguese Jews enjoyed the freedom of the city more as ordinary Dutch burghers than as members of a despised minority. The Jews' awareness of their anomalous freedom and its fragility is reflected in a remarkable document from the same year, much less well known, 1616, in which a representative of the community, probably Isaac Franco, petitioned the states of Holland, that's the governing body of the province of Holland, asking why the states refrained from posting placards publicizing a piece of imminent legislation that would prohibit sexual and polemical interactions between Jews and Christians. The Jews were fearful that publicizing such they weren't in principle against the legislation, but they were fearful that publicizing it might incite, quote, the common people of Amsterdam against the Jews, quote, so that in place of the liberty, that they, the Jews, have sought, they would find themselves with a new inquisition, and even the magistrates, with all their benevolence, could not be able to repair the damage afterwards. The author of the petition cited 3 reasons why the states should inform the Jews privately of this legislation rather than publicizing it. In fact, in the end, the states never passed any legislation concerning the Jews. It was only the city of Amsterdam, and this may have been in part because of this lobbying. The petition and appeal to the self-image of Amsterdam's ruling regent class cited these reasons. First, that in all these lands, liberty of conscience, liberdade de consciencias, is always conserved, and everyone abhors the name of the Inquisition. Second, that the Portuguese nation has, and they called themselves the Portuguese nation, they didn't yet call themselves the Jewish nation, has come to these lands in the last 20 years, fleeing the fire of the Inquisition and other harassments to which they are subjected, relying on the liberty of conscience conceded by these states, and they have been sheltered and favored by the gentlemen of the states and by the magistrates who treat them like their own inhabitants with love and respect. Third, that this Portuguese nation and the others who reside in these lands, enjoying liberty of conscience, are allowed to follow whatever law and religion they choose without being interrogated about it. If it were otherwise, it would be as if they were subject to another inquisition similar to that of Spain. In this petition, freedom of conscience was invoked as a presumptive fundamental principle of Dutch government. Dutch freedom was contrasted to the depredations of the Spanish Inquisition. What made this a powerful image was that in the Dutch national imagination, the Spanish Inquisition was held responsible for the persecution of the Reformed religion during Spanish rule. And this is a key theme in Dutch anti-Spanish propaganda, even though technically speaking the Spanish Inquisition was never active in the Netherlands. Charles V tried to establish it without success. In my view, the passage hints at a genuine identification on the part of Jews with this principle as one that had not only benefit for them but inherent value. The petition also thanks the magistrates, quote, who treat them like their own inhabitants, as I said, with love and respect, echoing the drift of the rabbinic statement cited above. This would indicate an early internalization of a concept of liberty not in the traditional sense of providential redemption, but as a political principle guaranteeing protection to the cities of a commonwealth. In these early statements, I admit there's no indication that the Amsterdam Jews viewed themselves as sharing in the religio-political idea of liberation expressed in the notion of Nederlands Israël. But in the late 17th century, a shared idea of liberty was incorporated into the public image of the Portuguese Jewish community in Amsterdam. Now, I've written about this in a long piece by Daniel Levy de Barrios, and I'm not going to get into that now. I want rather to look at a particular image. If we can have the slide here. Can I? I can. Can we perhaps lower the lights? Thank you. This is an image many of you will recognize. It's a commemorative etching by the Dutch engraver Romain de Hoog, depicting the dedication of the great Portuguese Jewish synagogue, the Esnocha, on a Sabbath evening of 1675. So you see these roundels to the left and right. On those you find the names of the members of the Mahamad, the leaders of the Jewish community, and the building committee, as well as the name of the artist and the date in the lower right. This etching was apparently presented to these leaders of the Jewish community at the time of the dedication and was presumably commissioned for that purpose. The large central scene depicts the synagogue during the opening moments of the dedication. The synagogue is filled with people, men in prayer shawls, some of them circling the bima with Torah scrolls, which is very much a theme here. We also see in the shadows women behind a grill. You can't really see them very well with this slide. In the foreground stand, and this is a very important element, in the foreground, well-dressed Christian onlookers, a presence which underscores the public civic nature of this ceremony. And now I want to go to a detail of this that I haven't discussed, and that is can I go back? How can I go back? Second? Okay. I want to look at this allegorical image which offers a commentary on the scene, which has really not been analyzed, to my surprise. But it's a very interesting image. So you can see here an allegorical tableau that is really quite arresting. On the left stands a priestly figure just behind an open Torah scroll. Can I point with this? Well, I can point this way. A priestly figure, you can see the incense here and the Torah scroll. Beneath him sits a female figure representing Judah, or Yehuda, with the tablets of the law. You can see them here. An image that evokes the verse from Jeremiah, Judah mourns and her gates languish. They sit on the ground in mourning. And on the opposite side, to the right, sits a figure representing the city of Amsterdam, here, with, if you look here, holding the banner of the city with one hand, 3 vertically ordered white St. Andrew's crosses on a field of black. And on the other hand, in the other hand, a staff pointed towards the Jewish figures. Beside this figure, it sits a rather scantily clad female figure wearing a girdle emblazoned with 4 shields, including the royal standard of the Netherlands and a shield, the shield of the Dutch Republic. She is also pointing with a finger towards the Jewish figures. On the cloud beneath, and this has been noted frequently, this little inscription on the cloud beneath is the inscription Libertas conscientia incrementum republicae, the freedom of conscience, and you can improve on my translation if you like, freedom of conscience makes the republic thrive. What seems most obviously to be happening in this tableau is that the Dutch Republic is granting liberty of conscience to the Jews who've suffered the tribulations of exile. But there's also a subtext here, in my view. The placement of the Torah scroll and the staff and finger pointed directly at it, if you look at it that way, imply a degree of reciprocity, as if to say that Jews have provided the foundational texts for the godly governance of the Dutch Republic, making the action quite circular. And while the caption would seem to reflect an act of benevolence on the part of the Dutch government, it suggests a scenario in which the Jews play a key role, for it's they who have proved to the world, through their mercantile activity, that religious freedom makes the Dutch Republic thrive, a theme which, of course, you know that Menashe ben Israel elaborated on. The fact that the leaders of the community must have chosen, or at least approved, this message means that it was felt to be appropriate for the occasion of the synagogue's dedication. They could certainly have chosen any number of biblical verses for the inscription. A word in conclusion. In the early modern period, before rights theory was widely accepted as a justification for the principles of the modern state, religious traditions provided the only available source of justification. Yet justification of the principles of the state by particularistic religious traditions was problematic in the post-Reformation period. England, the Dutch Republic, and France, to name only those where political thought was developing very rapidly, were multi-confessional states. In most of the 17th century, Jews could live openly in only one of these states, the Dutch Republic. It was there that Jews first witnessed the hammering out of a religious founding myth that enshrined an inclusive idea of liberty, liberty from tyranny, liberty from foreign occupation, liberty of conscience. This Dutch myth, whose origins preceded the arrival of the Portuguese Jews, had a biblical foundation. It provided the mechanism by which the new principles of liberty, as distinct from medieval ideas of customary local liberties, could be inculcated in all Netherlanders. It was a myth that, fortuitously or not, it's not actually an accident, had close parallels to the Portuguese Jews' own founding myth. The development of an attachment to the political values of the Dutch state among the Portuguese Jews was greatly facilitated by the convergence of these two myths, creating a bridge to a new political environment in which political values were justified philosophically, not religiously. It should be remembered that even in the emancipation period, citizens with different religious commitments continued to invest these common political values with religious meanings that were in some sense shared. That is, the working out of a place for Jews in Dutch civil religion in 17th century Amsterdam may have had some serendipitous features, but it was not a passing or insignificant development. Thank you.
Let me thank Professor Miriam Bodian for her erudite lecture.